Phantasy Star 3, The Generations of Doom. This is a very, very ambitious title. In short, it is effectively the JoJo of video games, if we ignore the fact that there are actual JoJo games, many of which are very, very good, some of which actually predate this game if we count Famicom Jump, but let's not do that because that game wasn't very good. Either way, this game is conceptually a generational RPG, and that's not a concept that is really kicked around too much. I know Dragon Quest V did it, and to be fair, it's the best Dragon Quest, so it was doing something right. Agarest War Zero did it, and now I remember Agarest War Zero exists, and now I'm just angry because, oh god, that game was abysmal. But I think the idea of a generational RPG makes a lot of logical sense in the evolution of the RPG itself, especially in regards to the thing that really resonated with me in regards to RPGs, even as a child. RPGs, to me, have always been grandiose, long-running, epic stories. They want to tell a big story about awesome heroes saving the day from insurmountable odds. Well, it only makes sense that eventually one of these events would be too great for one person and his party, and maybe they need to pass on the torch to the next generation. And in this case, the generation after that. I think that is such a brilliant and cool idea, and it really is the logical evolution of telling an RPG story, at least in terms of it being a grand sweeping adventure. Unfortunately, for all of its ambitions, this game does have some issues, especially around its final chapter, but we'll get there when we get there. That said, because of the structure of this game being so generational, I think in order to actively sort of convey what's going on, I'll probably have to give a broad sweeping narrative of the entire first chapter, and then bits and pieces of the second and third, just to kind of give you an idea of what's specifically going on with this story. So this one's going to be a bit of a long one. The story takes place about 1,000 years after a war between two races, the Orakians and the Layans. This war had raged on for so long and ingrained so much hatred that the two races, even today, still hate each other and actively remember all the atrocities committed in the war. The war ended with both races kind of becoming segregated on this world, and it's been so long since either of the two have actively interacted with one another that they don't even realize the other exists. That said, hatred breeds hatred, and a society built on hatred still means that even today, Orakians hate the Layans. The first 3 or so towns you go to are just filled with people spouting basically racist propaganda about how the Layans will steal your children and eat your pies, you know? It's really about having to break the cycle of hate, ultimately. It's almost like Phantasy Star was actually about something, and that, the previous one was about climate change and a bunch of other stuff as well. But I have to admit, it's kind of weird to see that this game is confident enough that 1,000 years later, people are still deeply rooted in their hatred based around a war that no one really remembers all that much, when in reality, we have scholars worried about the next generation not really learning the lessons from World War II because everyone who was there kind of is gone. This game has a lot of confidence in hatred continuing to breed hatred across generations, and it will be an important lesson across all of this. Either way, the first generation starts off with Prince Rhys of Landon. It's his wedding day. Congratulations! Yay! See, a little while ago, this random lady washed up on the beach. Her name was Maya, and he just fell in love with her and wants to get married to her. Bearing in mind she's amnesiac, she has no idea where she's from. She weirdly has blue hair, which no Iraqian has, except for Rhys. Don't think about that because the game never addresses it. And yeah, it's just time for their wedding, so we should probably go do that. But before we do that, because I've played Phantasy Star 2, I think it's important we go to the shop and get an emergency escape pipe, because the fact is, I know how important it is to get out of dungeons in the previous game. Let's just be a little bit careful. Anyway, we go to our castle and meet our bride. Isn't she wonderful? She'll be here for all of 2 scenes in the entire game and never seen again. And we go see good old King Daddykins to go and bless our wedding, except suddenly, surprise gargoyle comes and kidnaps her, saying that Maya will never belong to any Orakian, thus once again putting 2 and 2 together that she's a Layan, not that anyone in the game seems to do that. And Rhys decides to start a war with the Layans, bearing in mind that we don't even know if Layans still exist in this world, aside from the fact that Surprise Gargoyle said that she wouldn't belong to Orakians, and that she doesn't look like an Orakian in any capacity. But again, the people of this world are so entrenched in hate that they're not smart enough to put 2 and 2 together. Either way, King Daddykins decides that Rhys needs to cool out and take a time out in the dungeon. And here's where I actually have to come clean with you on something. See, I'm actually the world record holder for the speedrun to this game. Like, completely unintentionally, I fell ass first into the world record to this game. See, me being the smart cookie that I am, hey, I'm captured. I have a thing that lets me get out of situations exactly like this. Let's use our teleport item we invested in. And it works. And then things get weird. I wandered around the town and everyone in town just seemed to be spouting the same racist rhetoric they'd been the entire 2 minutes earlier. And I went back to the castle and my betrothed was there. And she seemed perfectly fine. I decided to go have a sit down with King Daddykins and, well, he congratulates me on being such a smart cookie and then tells me to do it again. Except not do what I did this time. I got this ending in a total of 5 minutes 15 seconds, and that wasn't me even trying. Bearing in mind that the world record holder before me in this game was 3 hours 1 minute, and that was with something called the generation skip. Presumably, they skipped a sizable chunk of this game. What I'm saying is this game probably needs more speedrunners, or I'm an absolute prodigy. Now, the sticklers out there may just suggest that I got some sort of non-standard game over, that the developers had to somehow write in because some playtester did the exact same thing I did because they played the first game and realized how important teleporting was. But counterpoint, my fiancé was safe. The war was over because it never began. We don't have to subject 2 more generations to hate and war and destruction because of my actions. I am a preemptive hero. Where is my trophy? But you're probably still wondering what actually happens after this, so fine, we'll do what the king says and restart the game and do it properly. Back in the castle prison, we meet Lena, who introduces herself to us for the first time, and this is important, because she won't be around until the end of the game. And yet, she's a pretty important character, allegedly? Either way, we escape our hometown and set off on the adventure of a lifetime to rescue our waifu, who we still know basically nothing about, and we don't really have any connection to her, and that's really not going to change at all over the course of this game. But welcome to the next hour of my life, where I wandered around accomplishing literally nothing because this map is really badly designed and the plot points are a little confusing. Just outside of your starting town is another town with a boat outside of it. Presumably that's going to be important. So we go inside and try and talk to everyone, and basically everyone is still spewing the same anti-Leian racist rhetoric as everyone else. There is, however, a sailor here who has an interest in a different race. See, he says that he's a sailor and a fisherman, except he doesn't go fishing without a cyborg, because it's good luck, I guess. Okay, side note, anytime this game mentions a cyborg, I'm pretty sure they mean android because, I mean, these cyborgs, quote unquote, are thousands of years old. Any sort of biological material in them would have decayed forever ago. Hell, we even meet a couple that have their faces melted entirely off, so yeah, their noun choice is a little bit incorrect. Either way, I guess we're on an adventure to find ourselves an android, not that we have any clue as to how to do that, but we do find another town just a little bit beyond this one bridge. Side note, the enemies change immediately upon crossing this bridge to another area's worth of enemies, and they are a little bit tougher. Also, everything at this point can poison you, which really, really sucks. Poison doesn't do what you think it does, by the way. It's not a gradual degradation of your health, it's the impossibility of healing in any capacity, including resting at an inn. You have to go to a specialist to heal poisoning, and every enemy out of the gate basically can do it to you. It sucks. So in this town that's just across this bridge, against much, much more difficult monsters, even though it's only a few tiles away, we find that there is someone who found a weird girl standing near a lake to the east. Presumably, this is where our journey will lead us. This is where we need to go to. We need to talk to this random lady, or hell, maybe that's our waifu. So we head off to the east to look for this random girl next to a lake, and what do you know? I found a lake. There wasn't anything there, though. I then proceed to waste the next hour of my life completely wandering around this map, finding absolutely nothing, because just slightly to the up of that lake is an identical lake that we actually need to find this person at. This will be a continuous theme with this game. The map design is atrocious. Anyway, the random lady we find is Mayu. She's effectively this game's equivalent of Ney, not in so much that she's a tragic character or anything, she's literally not. She's your team's babysitter and healer, but she's pretty awesome and she'll be with you for the rest of the game. She is an android who's been waiting for you for hundreds of years, apparently. Again, there's no way she's biological in any capacity. Either way, we take her back to the guy with the boat, we take the boat, and he talks on the way about how there's this magical cave at the bottom of the sea that you can see, and that is going to be important at the very last stage of the game where you need a magical MacGuffin, but you will never interact with it until the last stage of the game. Like literally the last half hour you have to go here, and there's nothing here, really. Either way, we get across the lake, and we find a magical cave, where at the deepest depths we find someone else. Someone with weird green hair who doesn't look like any Orakian we've ever met. Might be a Leyan. But again, our protagonist is so stupid and clouded with rage, he doesn't even know what a Leyan looks like. So, yeah. This is Lyle. He's a thief. He stole this awesome thing that can apparently be used to open specific caves. He then turns around and gives it to you. Lyle is the worst thief ever. Actually, Lyle in general is a very complicated character. And by complicated, I mean badly written and confusing to the end. Either way, we have what we need to. We cross back across the lake, and we go to the east to find a cave to open it with our new thing. Except it doesn't work. And then I proceed to waste another hour of my life just wandering around trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do, thinking I missed some kind of plot point. But just slightly to the up of that cave, beyond another thing that we can't interact with in any capacity, and slightly to the up of that, is an identical cave that will take us exactly where we need to go. But you know, at least this cave is visible. The next one won't be. The map design in this game is crap. Either way, welcome to the first transitory area of the game. There are a lot of them, and they all look identical, and they suck. Once you get across from this, you seem to be plopped out in a completely different world that's entirely covered in snow. We go to the nearby town, we learn that they are facing a climate issue. Once again, harkening back to Phantasy Star 2, and the fact that this series has always been about real-life problems we should be dealing with, and still haven't been because we've been too busy wasting money. Thanks, Jeff Bezos. Why not spend all that money and fix global crises? That'd be nice. Late-stage capitalism at its finest, folks. Either way, they ask us to go to the desert to fix the climate issue, I guess. So we then wander around aimlessly until we find two sets of ruins that don't do anything, but between them is the next transitory cave that isn't on a map, because reasons. Once we get across this, we get sent to a desert, and this is where the game gets to kind of a hard part. In the middle of the desert, there is a town. This is a town filled entirely by androids. Because they are androids, they cannot get poisoned, therefore they don't need a doctor, right? So they don't have one. And you know what would be absolutely devastating is if any enemies in this area did poison damage. Well, I've got 3 awesome facts about this area. First of all, androids absolutely can get poisoned. Mayu and your next partner, Ren, absolutely can. They are not immune to it, so there's a logical inconsistency for you. Second of all, there's a lot of enemies in this area that can do poison to you. And if you get it, it's basically a death sentence because you can't heal anywhere here unless you buy like an antidote or something. And third of all, and this is probably the worst part of all, the place where you get cured from poison? Yeah, that's also where you need to revive your party members if they get killed. So there's kind of not one of those here either, which is a bit of a problem. Either way, we're told to go far to the west to find a cave that should lead us to what we need so that we can go to the tower to fix the climate control issue. We go all the way to the west and we notice that there's a cave that is identical sitting next to another cave. Again, this map design, but only one takes you one place and the other takes you where you need to go. Pick the right cave, you go through a little dungeon, and you meet Ren, who says he can help with the climate control problem. Just get all the way to the other side of the desert to find a tower to do that. So we did that thing. And at the end of this climate control tower, we find Lyle again. Hooray! And it turns out he wants to be our bestest buddy now, because I guess being the worst thief ever wasn't enough of a career opportunity for him. So we take him along with us and head back to the area that was having a huge global climate crisis, except everything's fixed now. Awesome! So you wander around a different town in this area, and it turns out it is a kingdom of the Layans. You sneak into their dungeons, looking desperately for Maya, except, surprise, suddenly one-on-one fight with Lyle. Yeah. Except that his boss stats are reflected in his character stats, so if you just remove all of his equipment, he's a total chump. Yeah, so Lyle's actually a Layan if the fact that he had a green hair and no Orakian ever had green hair was not enough to tip you off. But he's also a prince. I might have forgotten to tell you about that. But don't worry about it, because Lena's here too, because I don't know. She's just here in the middle of Layan country for some reason, but she wants to team up with you too, to go help Maya. And then like 2 rooms later, you go and do that thing. And then chapter over, who are you gonna marry? So yeah, it feels a bit rushed at the end. There is actually like 1 extra dungeon in between the 2, but it is kind of backtracky as well. There's not really much to say about it. Either way, once you get to the end of the chapter, you are presented with an option. Who is Reese gonna marry? Is he going to marry Maya or Lena. And here's where I have a severe problem with all this. See, we have no connection to either of these characters. Reese ostensibly loves Maya, but he's only known her for, what, a couple of months? I think the game says they've known each other for like 3 months. Maya doesn't even know who Maya is, so how can Reese know about her? How can he have gotten together and really learned who she is as a person to the point where he knows he wants to marry her? Conversely, we have Lena, who has even less than that, sorta. I mean, at least the game tells us we're in love with Maya at the start of it, kinda. I mean, that's not much, but that's at least something. Lena, she shows up like right before the end, and we're just supposed to want to pick her as our wife for some reason. The thing is, I think she is more than just some random lady, because I have read that ostensibly before Reese decided to marry Maya, they were going to be engaged. I don't think I've seen it anywhere said in-game. I'm basing this all off of external information I picked up from guides and walkthroughs. Literally, when we first meet Lena, she introduces herself to us, and granted, that's for the player's convenience, I'm sure, but it just seems phrased really weird for the person who is ostensibly your former fiance. Either way, you can pick one of the two girls we have absolutely no connection to in order to start the next generation. And here's where the game gets interesting, because the generation varies very much depending on which character you marry, not just in your offspring, but their adventure. I didn't play through both of them, but I got the general impression of each character and their starting adventure, and we'll go from there. So if we marry Lena for some reason, our offspring is Niall, and he's basically Reese 2.0. He's entirely a melee fighter, and he's very, very boring. His adventure is to go out and fight some enemy horde that seems to be sort of making advances on your people. I was immediately checked out when I heard that was the plot and kind of stopped after 2 fights with him, if I'm being honest. Whereas if we marry Maya, our offspring is Ein, spelled with an A and a Y and not an E and an I for reasons, because this is a series spelled Phantasy Star with PH for some reason. And Ein is kinda awesome. He hits pretty hard like his dad, but he also has access to healing magic, and he's invaluable with it. So yeah, we're gonna continue on with Ein here. And Ein's whole plot is, suddenly robots are destroying everything, which is a nice callback to Phantasy Star 2, honestly. But it's also far more interesting to see where that goes, if I'm being entirely honest. And it completely changes all the enemies on the overworld, so that's really, really cool. Ein is infinitely more interesting than Niall. So in broad strokes, the first half of Ein's adventure is trying to rescue Lyle's daughter, who, because Lyle's such a good friend to Ein's father, kind of made him Ein's uncle, which makes her kind of Ein's cousin. This will be important later. His adventures then lead him back to Reese's old castle, where he meets Sari, a complete joke of a warrior who goes down basically instantly, even though she brought hordes and hordes of backup. She then decides to follow you. It's also worth noting that because this is Reese's father's castle, and she's the princess of it, this also makes her probably Ein's cousin. And then basically ends with Ein fighting off the robot threat. And then this game asks the bold and ambitious question of, so which one of your cousins you want to marry? To be fair, this is actually pretty accurate to royal lineage back in the day for what that's worth, but yeah, don't think about it too hard if you can help it. Either way, if you pick Lyle's daughter, you have a wonderful marriage ceremony where Lyle even gives his blessings, even though he cannot possibly be in there because he kind of took off just after giving one of the most confusing statements ever in the story prior. Lyle is such a badly written character. But your offspring is Sean. And Sean is kind of like the ultimate mage. He has fantastic green hair like his grandpa, but because magic kind of sucks, you probably don't want to play as Sean too much, really. He's kind of built like a bag of chips. He kind of crumples real fast. Sean's whole inciting incident is that his entire town gets basically nuked off the planet. He actually genuinely has one of the most interesting intros to his story. Alternatively, if Ein chooses to marry his possibly actually biological cousin Sari, your end result is Chris. I ended up going with Chris because while he is basically Reese 3.0 and he's entirely a melee character, he hits harder than any character in the game. Also, his outfit is just snazzy. His entire inciting incident is that the villain from the previous chapter is allegedly back, and that's kind of your lot to go on. And you might sound like I'm not really going too much into detail here, and part of it's because I want you to discover this on your own if you really want to play this, but the third generation is where this whole ambitious project kind of falls apart. Whereas Niall and Ein's adventures were wildly different, they went to different places, they had different inciting incidences, and they fought different things. Yeah, see, Sean and Chris have, aside from their inciting incident, basically entirely identical adventures. And again, while I didn't play as Niall to play as his offspring, I took a look at a guide, and yeah, outside of the inciting incident, the entire third generation appears to be entirely identical regardless of who you pick, which is more than a little underwhelming, especially for how ambitious and interesting this is. I can only think this was probably a budgetary issue, because the entire last chunk of this game is primarily just wandering around the map over and over looking for weapons that you can go fight the final boss because reasons. Hell, most of the time I felt lacking in direction. I was just wandering around for want of something to do because the game didn't really give me any sort of idea where I needed to go or purpose. It's a very weird change in direction for what was primarily a very guided adventure up to this point. And each of the end resulting chapters feels, from what I can tell and from what I've read, seemingly identical. And the whole thing kind of falls apart, which sucks, because if you want to play this game, I would recommend playing through one playthrough, regardless of what you've played. Play the other second chapter and then just watch the endings on YouTube. Basically, if you've played both second chapters and one final chapter, you've experienced everything this game can really give you, more or less. And that's disappointing to say the least. There's also the problem of the fact that the main characters really don't have that much character given to them, and part of that, I think, is because they are designed to effectively be modular. You could have Chris, you could have Sean, you could have the other two, it doesn't really matter. Your protagonist is always going to be your protagonist, so why focus on writing for one specific character to really flesh them out? Which sucks, because at least Reese had a starting point as kind of Prince Racist, who was overly hot-headed and ready to head off to his death to try and start a war with a different race just to rescue his girlfriend that he didn't even know. That was at least something. The other characters barely have a starting moment to actually build a character off of, and then they just sort of stop. And granted, this is a problem that proceeded in the previous Phantasy Star as well. You had like one line of dialogue with your character to get a feel for who they are, and then they kind of stopped having a character until the very end. It just sucks that there's not really all that much time given to actually building characters at all. And in turn, when you combine that with the final chapter, the writing really falls off, especially near the end, and that sucks. The gameplay to Phantasy Star 3 is a fairly standard RPG for the time. It does stand out as trying to fix some of the problems from the previous Phantasy Star game, and it does succeed in some degree, but it has just as many problems and is equally esoteric in a lot of ways. The standard gameplay loop is rather simple. You wander around town talking to people, but most of the information gathering in this game is fairly lacking. Most NPCs don't actually tell you anything terribly useful while wandering around towns. When you're out in the overworld, you can wander around and get into random encounters, which are dictated by specific areas on the map. Whenever you cross a bridge or get to like another slight variation of an area, you'll run into a different set of enemies that have a slight buff to their attacks. It's fairly standard RPG stuff. Although, as I did say, around where you start, everything basically does poison to you, or at least can, and without any sort of greater explanation as to what poison does, you could be really in for a bad time. Because poison doesn't drain your health, it means that you can't heal, even at an inn. And then you have to go find a special guy that will fix poison, and that's in the upstairs area of a secondary building, and none of the upstairs areas in any of the buildings are otherwise used, so it's kind of a weird moment of the game being inconsistent with itself. Once you get into a random encounter, however, this is where things kind of change from the previous entry, because the game isn't entirely an auto-battler. It defaults to an automatic system, but you can individually pick your characters, what you want them to do, and which individual enemy you want them to attack. And that is a huge improvement over the previous game, if going through all of the individual menus actually wasn't the worst thing ever, because it takes several seconds to load up each menu, and you have to do it with every single character. Likewise, it would actually only be really terribly helpful if there was a reason to do it. And honestly, there wasn't. You can pretty much just default the entire game to auto battle, where every character will just automatically melee attack whatever enemy, and you'll be perfectly fine. The only time I ever had problems with this in gameplay was with the final boss, and that was when I wanted two of my characters to heal just so that I didn't get caught off guard by taking too much damage. For the most part, setting the game to auto battle is more or less a dominant strategy in this game. But there's also a specific reason as to why you would want to keep the characters on your default auto battling setting, and that is that they do default to just melee attacking. And the thing is, magic in this game is kind of awful. Like, from my experience, pretty much all of the offensive magic abilities are inferior in terms of damage to your actual melee. So setting a character to specifically use magic to attack enemies is actively a worse strategy than just having them default to their standard attack, just picking whatever enemy they want. Indeed, in my experience, the only useful magic that was even in this game was the healing magic. Now, you might suggest that, well, you could then try and spec into some sort of magic healing build, right? And in this game, yeah, you can kind of do that. Sorta. The game doesn't explain it very well at all. Basically, you can go to a building in town that will allow you to adjust your magic for a fee of such a small amount of money, no monster will drop it, and that's cool. That basically means that for effectively free, you can change how your character's magic properties are, and on paper, that's amazing. In practice, it's confusing, and I'm not sure it actually works. So you tell him you want to respec your magic, and then he presents you with a box where the borders are like different images, and you're just supposed to pick a specific point in the box, and that's your magic strength. Now, I think what you're supposed to do is each of these symbols that represent the edges of this box correspond to a specific magic spell. So if you have more of an image that corresponds to one spell, you should be able to use more of it, or it's stronger, or something. Yeah, magic in this game is confusing at the best of times. In addition, when you actually go into the menus to use your magic, there's a number next to that magic. Now, basic RPG doctrine would dictate that that number next to your magic spell would be how much magic points or equivalent that would use. You know, your renewable resource, so you can figure out exactly how much of this magic you need to use and how much you need to keep in your back pocket in case you're in a dangerous situation. Here, that number doesn't seem to correspond to anything. Like, at the start, I noticed that my healing spell had a number of 11 next to it, so I figured, okay, this uses 11 MP. It used 5. I couldn't figure out why. Later on, it got something like a 20 or 30 next to it, and it still only used 5 MP, so I'm not sure what that number corresponds to. I then sort of thought that maybe that corresponds to the strength of the magic, like if it has an 11 next to it, it will heal 11 health, or if it was an attack spell, it would do 11 damage or something, but no, that doesn't seem to be the case either. So these numbers next to your magic spell seemingly do nothing, and correspond to nothing and inform the player of nothing and just leave them scratching their heads, or at least it did for me. I have no idea. Magic in this game is completely garbage, outside of healing to begin with, so there's not really a lot of reason to spend all that much time here. In fact, the entire building where you can respec your magic is never at any point actually required to go into. Actual navigation to actually make plot happen in this game is just an absolute nightmare as well. It's not just the fact that they'll weirdly hide the areas you need to go to behind other things that are effectively identical in basically the same place, although that is a problem. It's not just the fact that they will hide places in the critical path you need to go to that aren't marked on the map in any capacity. That's also a problem. It's not even just the fact that there are areas in the early game that correspond to things you only get in the late game, leaving you scratching your head as to what any of these landmarks are. That's also a problem. No, it's the problem that the map's generally really confusing to navigate because there's otherwise not really much in helping orient you. And the fact is, you do kind of get a map at the start of the game, but you have to go through the menus to use it, which means you have to open up your menu, open up your item menu, open up the character who has the items to take a look at the specific thing, and then you run into one real problem, because, I'm sorry, I might have misspoke. Did I say that the overworld was confusing in this game? Yeah, I meant overworlds, because there's like 8 of them. And they're really awful as to trying to figure out where the hell you are, because sure, there's one that's a desert, and there's one that's sort of a snowy area for a while, but most of them are just sort of generic grassland with like some kind of lake or water feature. They become very, very similar, and it gets very, very confusing. And then when you tie into the fact that, you know, locations you need to go to are hidden behind other locations that are basically right next to it, or hidden entirely from view, to which you can't find at all because for some reason that second tunnel just isn't marked on the map in any capacity, you know, it's really bloody confusing. It doesn't help that when you finally think you've oriented yourself on a map, you have to move on to the next area using these tunnels, which are sort of like mini dungeons, and they are all visually identical. Like, sure, the layouts of the dungeons are completely different, but they all have the same tile sets. There are a total of 2. You either have one that is a castle prison, which is just sort of some generic cobblestone nonsense tiles, or you're in what is effectively a flashing rainbow-colored background. It's not that big a deal, no seizure warnings or anything, I don't think. Layered upon by some scaffolding. and that's every dungeon in the game. So even when you get used to it and you're told where you need to go, you might completely confuse where you need to go because all the caves that interconnect all these maps and overworlds are just confusingly similar. And I'm not just saying this got me lost a few times. I mean, by the end of the game, I could not navigate this game, and I had been everywhere. It doesn't help that when you finally kind of get a hang on what you're looking for, the game introduces a new travel method that requires you to go to a different location that's sort of like a one-way teleporter to another specific location. So your solution at that point is to basically go through several tunnels, wasting basically an hour's worth of time to where you need to go. It should also be noted that this game is intolerably slow. They did not fix this from Phantasy Star 2. It is still an unbelievably slow game, and outside of recording, I was playing this game entirely with the fast forward button held down. Or to take these random teleporters on each map, hoping that you go where you need to go, but you don't have that much experience because it's introduced at the 11th hour. It's such a baffling choice as to why you would structure the navigation of this game the way they did. And even by the end, I had no idea where I was going. I am so thankful I have the actual Genesis manual that came with this, which is like this giant phone book walkthrough, because without that, I would have no idea where I would need to go in order to get where I needed to go. In addition to the fact that the game actively just chooses not to tell you what you need to do next every now and then, and you're just sort of wandering around for want of something to do. The dungeons, however, are a huge step forward from Phantasy Star 2. No longer are they multi-layered labyrinths of confusion that require you to make bizarre leaps in logic in order to make any sort of progress. And gone are the days where every single room and floor has a different set of enemies that requires grind to even meet on their own level. That is huge. Now you can just go into a dungeon and every enemy is roughly consistently the same level, or at least not substantially a jump in stats, so that you have to wander around hoping that you build your character up enough that you can actually make progress. There's even a few really neat little things. Early on, one of the first castles you go to actually has like a secret teleporter in it that you need to take. But if you actually talk to the NPCs in one of the few instances of them actually being useful, they'll tell you where it is. Unfortunately, this also devolves later on to one of the final dungeons basically being a bizarre teleport maze layout that is just confusing and a huge waste of time to navigate. When you couple that with the fact that some of them do get fairly long, and the fact that they all have roughly more or less the same tile sets, you can get lost very, very easily thinking you know where to go because you've already experienced this exact path before, except it's totally different. It just looks entirely identical. The navigation in this game in general really could use a lot more landmarks and bespoke tiles just to help differentiate anything from one another, just so that it doesn't all bleed together and you get lost far more frequently than you really need to. That said, you don't have to wander around in an area that should put you on the overworld in order to find a dungeon behind a dungeon in order to get where you need to go, so that's a big plus. The overall pacing, especially in terms of bosses, is very similar to the previous game. Each chapter has maybe 2 bosses, and they're pretty far out in the end of them. So it's not like you're met with all that many bosses or big bads or really leading up to anything. It's really just doing a bunch of busy work until you get to the end when you actually fight a boss. And most of the time, it's just someone who comes out of nowhere and you have no idea who they are. It's a little bit weird, and honestly, they could build up the bosses a little bit better and make them a little bit more meaningful in terms of characters. For all its issues, however, I think overall the gameplay to Phantasy Star 3 is leaps and bounds better than the second one. It certainly gives you all the combat options in the world, at least this time around, and while there is a bit of a grind, it does seem to have been cut down substantially. Though that might have been because I got lost for substantial periods of time in this game. Either way, I think the dungeons are substantially better, and it's just, in general, a far easier experience. Like I said, you can pretty much just live off of auto-attacking till the end and be perfectly fine. But the fact that the second chapter is going to be wildly different, and regardless of which chapter and which generation you're on, you're always going to be dealing with a rotating cast of characters that will at least change 60% of what your party makeup is, that keeps things interesting and makes it a really engaging experience. I like this game substantially more as a game than Phantasy Star 2. The presentation, however, is the exact opposite. If we were to compare this to Phantasy Star 2, I think it is a tremendous setback in its own rights. But the sad thing is, I see so much potential here that is kinda squandered. Visually, there are some absolutely amazing visuals in this game. Each chapter starts with some absolutely gorgeous full-screen visuals, and the game ends on them as well, and they are absolutely beautiful. But outside these moments, you will never see anything else like this over the course of the game. Phantasy Star 4 fixes that though, which is a good thing. It sucks to know that there's this amazing artwork in this game, but you just don't see it for most of the game. And that clearly there was a lot of hard work put into this, and just, it's such a small, minute part that it's almost forgettable how little of it is actually in the game. Combat screens no longer show your character, and I think that's a huge setback, and I wonder if that's just because there is such a rotating cast of playable characters they didn't want to make animated character models for every single encounter. Likewise, enemy sprites don't actually animate outside of attacks, which is a bit boring. On the other hand, however, combat scenes are entirely distinct relative to the biomes they're in. This does, however, have the problem that there's so few tile sets in the game, you'll still be seeing the same ones over and over and over, but you're not fighting in a nebulous vector grid that just sort of screams sci-fi 80s nonsense that is largely indistinct from anywhere else in the game. So there are some pluses and minuses here. The enemy visuals are also very, very good, and just in general, I think the game looks okay, but the biggest problem this game has, especially if we were to compare this to Phantasy Star 2, is that it lacks any sort of visual distinction from anything. Phantasy Star 2 used bright, colorful, high-vibrancy palettes that had a great deal of distinction from anything else around the time. It screams 80s sci-fi neon cheese nonsense, which admittedly clashes with the dark themes of that game, but still, you remember how the game looks. Whereas this one uses a colder, more somber palette, and it makes it lose any sort of visual distinction. And visually, it's just honestly very, very drab and cold and unremarkable compared to a lot of other games that were coming out around this time. Also, shoutouts to the shopkeeper for the armor shop, who's the protagonist from Phantasy Star 2. It's a nice little touch. It's nice to see he's getting some work. And audio-wise, it's much the same. The music just sounds very cold and somber, and while it fits the tone of the game well enough, it is just completely indistinct from anything else. Many of the theme songs, especially the shop theme from Phantasy Star 2, will live rent-free in my head until the day I die. I just finished Phantasy Star 3, and I could not tell you any song from this game that is remotely memorable to me. I have instantly forgotten all of it, and that's genuinely how I feel about this. It is a game that does have moments of brilliance in its presentation, and yet it feels like they're ultimately all completely squandered. Now, if you want a copy of Phantasy Star 3 on the Sega Genesis, cheapest copy I see on eBay right now is about $45, shipping included, which makes it slightly higher than Phantasy Star 2's, although I will say I've also seen it substantially lower. It's kind of heavily fluctuating, but it kind of sits around the $30 mark. You can also get this as part of the Sega Genesis collection on Steam, where it's basically a DLC for like $3 or so. And this was sent to me for free, so I don't have any complaints about that price point. It's a pretty solid price, and you get a pretty decent chunk of game for this, but I'm not sure I'd necessarily say it's outright better than Phantasy Star 2. I think they're inversions of one another. Phantasy Star 2 had an amazing presentation. For what little story you got, it was great, especially for its characters, but as a game, everything about it was misery. Phantasy Star 3, on the other hand, while it's ambitious as all hell and I respect it for what it's trying to do, the story falls apart, especially near the end, because of how samey every chapter ultimately becomes, and the presentation itself just feels unremarkable and drab and cold and kind of lifeless, ultimately. But the game itself, as a game, functions substantially better than Phantasy Star 3. It's far more approachable, it's far easier to get to, albeit perhaps a little too easy, but at least you don't have to sit around fiddling with menus all the time if you don't want to. Ultimately, these two games are kind of like opposite sides of the same coin. One doing the presentation story substantially better, the other doing the game substantially better. Honestly though, I think Phantasy Star 3 is a lot less memorable and infinitely less considered a classic because it just doesn't immediately strike you when playing this. It is effectively a standard RPG, and until you get to the second and third chapters, you don't even really feel the generational nonsense. And they could do so much more for it, and ultimately I think it was a resource or money or time problem that really hampered that final chapter. And the saddest thing of all is, had they really clinched making every chapter feel different from one another, this would have been an absolute home run in terms of its concept's execution. As it stands, it's a great concept, but it needs so much more work to make it really stand out. But it's still a solid RPG, and it is in a lot of ways an improvement from Phantasy Star 2, but I don't think this is going to be anywhere near as good as Phantasy Star 4.